Okay, good afternoon. I have the privilege of being the speaker after lunch. That's always what every presenter aims for, is keeping everybody awake after they've eaten. So it seems to be a trend here for me at Post. So I'm looking forward to entertaining you guys this afternoon. Before we get started, I do think there are some housekeeping items. First, obviously, as you know, with Zoom, please make sure your microphones are muted. And John, I don't know, or Dawn, I don't know if there were like any specific other I have a couple of housekeeping items, but I don't know if there was anything specific that you all needed to mention before I keep going.
Hi, Megan. Thanks. Hi, everybody. Well, we just encourage you to ask questions. The whole point of today is that you leave better than you showed up. A lot of great information, but it might spark some questions. So if it does, there's a chat feature here in Zoom. You can click on chat. We'll be monitoring that. There's also a chat feature in the Wova, or Wova, however you say that, platform. We'll be monitoring both chat rooms. Megan's going to take a break every so often and ask if there's any questions, and Dawn and I will feed your questions to Megan so that we can get them answered. So thanks for joining us.
Perfect. So first, I just want to state that this session is not going to be discuss Post mandates or whatever your legislative requirements are. If that's what you're looking for, you missed that session with Karen Lizito yesterday. So if you're looking for that, I encourage you to go back and watch that recorded session. What this session will be talking about, what I will be talking about, is the politics behind those mandates, how they are made, and what Post does before, during, and after those mandates are set upon you all and your agencies. So a couple of my own personal housekeeping items. I do want this to be as interactive as possible. I know that's really difficult in a Zoom virtual environment. As John said, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. Between him and Dawn, they'll be keeping track of those questions for me. I will be trying my best to stop and ask for questions as we go, rather than this one long extended question and answer period at the end, but we'll have that too. But all of that's going to be kind of pending on time as well. I'm also going to hopefully take a break. 2 hours is a long time to sit there. So hopefully we'll fit a break in there. And I'm also going to attempt to do some breakout rooms. So don't run away yet. I promise you it will be fun as long as we have time to do it. But my intention is really that I hope you leave this session having learned something and hopefully had some fun. My contact information will also be given at the end. I'm always happy to respond to emails or with questions or concerns at any time. Okay, so for my first dose of doom and gloom, I do need to remind you that this session is recorded and anything you type in the chat is subject to a PRA. I strongly encourage you to reach out to me offline via phone if there are any questions that you have that you feel maybe of concern that you don't want to ask here. Totally okay with that. Okay, so I don't know if I introduced myself. My name is Megan Katafi. I serve as Post Legislative Liaison and Public Information Officer. My job here at Post is to track, monitor, and report on legislation that affects Post and law enforcement in general. I educate lawmakers, their staff, and the public on California standards and training requirements. And I'm basically the middle person between Post and the legislature. I don't know if anybody really asks to have that position, but I did. However, you are not allowed to get mad at me if a mandate becomes a law that you don't like, that I'm not responsible for. My other role here at Post, which they said would only be 5% of my job, is to respond to media questions and to educate members of the media on who Post is. And in case you didn't guess, that's way more than 5% of my job. So But my job is also to communicate with you all. I love to hear from the field, whether it's concerns, questions, feedback, you name it. Just again, no complaints. I don't take those. I get enough of those from my kids at home. So a little bit about me. Prior to joining Post, I was the training manager for the California Police Chiefs Association. If any of you have signed up your chief or your command staff for role of the chief, or sent any of your staff to the Women Leaders in Law Enforcement Conference, then there's a chance you've worked with me at some point. I spent 7 years in that role and enjoyed every minute of it. During that time, I also staffed their legislative committee and was pivotal in the chiefs starting their grassroots efforts to communicate on many legislative issues. I've been at Post now for almost 2 years, and I enjoy being on the other side of the table. Obviously, my knowledge as a training manager and a presenter has allowed me to speak on all different levels. However, my original calling was to be a pastry chef. I became enthralled with baking at a very young age. I got my degree in business management, and I went off to the Culinary Institute of America in New York, and I was determined to own my own bakery one day. But of course, as we all know, life happens, and I don't work in the industry any longer, but I still enjoy baking and making desserts for my friends and family. I've found that baking is a fantastic way to relieve stress. I know when we all began quarantine, a lot of people started baking. I was not one of those people, but definitely baked other things besides bread, which is what everybody seemed to be starting to bake. And I learned that today is National Dessert Day. So I hope you will all at some point today celebrate National Dessert Day for me. Speaking of my family, these are my children, Anthony and Christina. Anthony is 7. He loves Minecraft, Legos, and he wants to be Spider-Man when he grows up. I have not burst that bubble yet. I'll let him believe that that's what he can be for as long as he would like to. But if he's heading off to college, I might have to let him know that he can't take any classes on being Spider-Man. Christina, she's almost 13. She, like every preteen, loves Ariana Grande and watching TV. And I think most of all, she loves to stare at herself in the mirror, because that's what preteens do, apparently. She wants to be an actress someday and is well on her way to mastering the art of drama. I think anyone that has any girls can certainly understand that. So my spare time is definitely spent with them. And like the rest of the country, we are mastering distance learning and working from home. So I'm sharing this picture with you because it's absolutely one of my favorites. This picture is me photobombing then Chief Kim Rainey of West Covina, and then Senator Mark Leno at a legislative event at the Capitol. I've included this picture because it reminds me to not take everything so seriously. This job can be very, very serious at times and very stressful. But I find that you can't get too caught up in the drama or it will absolutely consume you. At the end of the day, we're simply all just people. Okay, so enough about me. Here's what we're going to talk about today. And again, I encourage you to ask questions as we go, and I'll pause to address them. So the first thing we're going to talk about is legislation in California. I'm going to address the legislative cycle in California and what makes us different from the rest of the country. I'm going to talk about recent legislation, what's been passed recently and how it affects law enforcement, including use of force. We'll discuss the political climate, what happened during the 2020 session and how it impacted law enforcement. And here's where I hope that we can pause for a short breakout session. I promise it won't be difficult. Then under what's next, we'll discuss what to expect in the next session. I call it reading the political tea leaves. And then I think it's also important to talk about what happens after a bill is signed. So that we'll go over under the aftermath. And I'll also address some of the obstacles and nuances that Post is faced with after a bill becomes law. And the last thing we're going to talk about is ways to be involved in your roles as training managers and citizens in your community. So I'm sure at some point, even though you chose to be here, you've asked yourself, how does legislation relate to my job? So as training managers, your agency depends on you to know what is mandated and necessary for all the officers at your department. There are many, 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 as you know, mandated trainings that your officers must take. Understanding and monitoring potential new mandates will help you in scheduling or knowing what your officers must do. And when new laws or regulations get passed, Post obviously disseminates that information, and in your role, you will assist in passing that information along or to ensure the officers are understanding that new law. For example, when AB 392 and the new use of force standards were enacted, Post pushed out tons of information and training to help understand that new standard. And your role is critical at your agency to make sure your officers are observing, understanding, and following those laws. Making sure officers are trained on important topics can protect them and your agency from potential scrutiny or even litigation. And even simply knowing and understanding the legislative climate can assist you in making sure your officers are trained in particular topics prior, that's the key word, prior to becoming law. Imagine being able to tell your community members that your officers have already received training of that topic. So now I'm going to do, hopefully it works, a short, easy poll just to gauge how familiar you are with the legislative process. It's a live poll, obviously. It will help me to either speak in greater detail or not bore you to death with information you already know. So here we go. It should pop up on your screen here. I'll give everyone a minute to choose your answer, and then I will post the live results so everybody can see. Okay, so far, I'll give it a couple more seconds here. Looks like most of you have stopped. So it looks like today I get to teach you guys something. So that, oh, I haven't shared the results. Here we go. So that is going to be really exciting for me. So thank you very much for taking that. Okay. Hopefully that's off your screen. Okay, so.
As your body grows bigger,
your mind must flower.
it's great to learn. It's great to learn. As your body grows bigger.
Okay, gotta love technology. So let's talk about how legislation works in the state of California. In discussing legislation, it's vital to know how it works. So who remembers this Schoolhouse Rock video? I sing this song at least daily in my head, thankfully, to everyone around me. And I've played it for Post staff during a meeting I did with them, and they all seem to like it. So, so obviously it's fashioned to the national level, but the concept's the same. So please enjoy yourself for the next 3 minutes with the childhood flashback.
Your mind must flower.
It's great to learn.
'Cause knowledge is power. It's Schoolhouse Rocky, the chip on the block of your favorite schoolhouse, Schoolhouse Rock.
I'm just a bill.
Whew, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee. But I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I'll sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will. But today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what happens?
Then I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yes. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I'll wait in a line with a lot of other bills for the president to sign. And if he signs me, then I'll be a law. I hope and pray that he will. But today I am still just a bill.
You mean even if the whole Congress says you should be a law, the president can still say no?
Yes, that's called a veto. If the president vetoes me, I have to go back to Congress and they vote on me again, and by that time you're so
By
old.
that time, it's very unlikely that you become a law. It's not easy to become a law, is it?
No, but how I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
He signed your bill. Now you're a law.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so it looks like you guys all enjoyed that. I'm really glad. All right, so let's talk about how this works in California. So in California, there is an assembly with 80 members and a Senate with 40 members. The assembly currently has 61 Democrats, 18 Republicans, and 1 independent. The Senate has 29 Democrats and 11 Republicans. So if you do your math, this means that the Democratic Party holds a supermajority in both houses. Both the Senate and the Assembly have been led by the Democratic Party since 1970. I did learn, though, that the Assembly briefly was led by Republicans from 1995 to 1996. So being that we are in an election year, I think it's important to point out that California legislature is always an election year. So it's really interesting to know that every 2 years, 1/2 of the Senate, so 20 seats, is subject to election, with odd numbered districts up for election during presidential elections and even numbered districts up for election during midterm elections. All 80 assembly seats are subject to election every 2 years. So you're probably asking yourself, like, well, why do I care? Why do I need to know this? Well, this is how it contributes to our political environment. So obviously issues for legislation are constituent driven, as well as driven by current events. We clearly saw this play out this year with a lot of the police reform measures. But most, if not all, of the proposed bills that we saw were driven by national events occurring. So if the legislature is constantly in this reoccurring election period, they're going to be driven by these matters because they want to continue to be elected. So I think that's important to really note in this process. Okay, so no, you're not seeing anything. The text is like this on purpose because that's how my brain feels at times when people start throwing out acronyms and terms that I have never heard of. I think that's a problem in life, especially in law enforcement. There's so many acronyms and jargon that surround legislation that I wanted to give you a few key terms that are important to understand, and you're just going to bear with me because there's several, but I promise you at the end of this presentation, it's all going to tie together and you're going to be like, thank God she took a minute and kind of explained all of these. The rulemaking process behind legislation can be very complicated and often feels like they're just making up rules as they go, but I promise you that there are actual processes and terms and rules that do apply. So I'm just going to pull up my little bill dictionary right here. So the first one is simple, AB and SB. We see that a lot before bill numbers. That is in reference to AB standing for Assembly Bill and SB standing for Senate Bill. The next, it's not really a term, but a body that I want to talk about that you would hear in legislative jargon that I think is important to bring up is the Legislative Council. So this council they are basically the body that are the group of attorneys for the legislature. They are elected jointly by both houses, and they are the body that's responsible for drafting all the bills, the amendments, and they prepare the summaries of each bill. They also provide legal opinions when legislators are coming up with their language. The next term I want to, yes?
Yeah, just before you move on, there's a question on point. The question is AB versus SB designated by who introduced the bill?
Yes. So if the author is from the Senate, then the bill would be an SB, and the same on the Assembly side. So the next term I want to bring up is, I hear this a lot, a spot bill. A spot bill is a bill that when it's introduced and you're reading it and you're like, well, that doesn't really do anything. And there might be a couple of changes, like they add the word the, or it might be a sentence. Those are spot bills. And what those are, they are bills that will be changed at a later time. There are deadlines that legislators have to meet. And so maybe their ideas aren't fully together. So they will do a spot bill, they will introduce it to meet that deadline, and then they will make amendments to it later. So I always say, if you see a bill and you're like, well, that seems weird, keep your eye on those. Those are spot bills. The next term I want to talk about is appropriations. Appropriations is a committee on both sides. There's one in the Senate and one in the Assembly. And that committee is the committee that is in charge of bills that contain funding. So the legislature sets funding, spending limits at the beginning of each 2-year session. And I know I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit here. I promise it'll all tie together. They're the ones who set those funding or spending limits. And when a bill has a fiscal component to it, it will always go through appropriations. The next term I want to talk about is gut and amend. This is when amendments are made to a bill that will completely remove the current contents and replace them with entirely different ones. You might see occasionally a bill listed as either in first, second, or third reading. Every bill goes through 3 readings. The first 2 are pretty simple. First reading is when a bill is introduced and is read on the appropriate House floor. Second reading is usually the title is simply read again on the floor. It's listed in the daily file. But it's the third reading that the most action happens. At the third reading, that is when the bill is finally eligible for floor debate and final vote. So most action that we see is in that third reading stage. And again, that is on the Assembly or the Senate floor. The next term I want to talk about is consent calendar. So sometimes you might be viewing a committee hearing, or maybe not, maybe that's just me. But you might hear consent calendar. So a consent calendar is typically a group of non-controversial bills. So in other words, they haven't received any sort of letter of opposition. There hasn't been any concerns from other members of the legislature. And there have been no votes on the bill. So those bills will typically be added to the consent calendar, and they'll be pushed through the committee, and they may be heard at a later time, but basically they're saying these bills are okay, we're gonna push them through. Now, an amendment, as simple as it sounds, that's when an alteration is made or proposed to be made in a bill, a motion, a resolution, or a clause by adding, changing, substituting, or omitting language. So amendments can happen in many forms, and they can happen basically throughout the life of the bill up until there's a final deadline when you cannot make any more amendments. So amendments can be made either by the author or by the committee. Sometimes they might be suggested in the committee. They might be suggested by another legislator on the floor. And sometimes the author who owns the bill essentially, they might not like those amendments, but the committee can still push them through, and those are considered hostile amendments. I have never seen any hostile amendments be made, although I'm sure they occur. Okay. The next term I want to talk about is an inactive file. Sometimes you might see either in my legislative updates I post on the Post website a bill that goes what they call inactive. So that is typically legislation that's ready for floor consideration, but for whatever reason, it goes dormant. So the author can choose for them to not be heard. They want to stop action on it. Maybe there's conversations that are happening behind the scenes that need to continue. But the author can move their bill to inactive, and they can also, if deadlines permitting, they can have it go back, but a 1-day notice to the public is required for it to go back on any sort of committee agenda. We're almost done, I promise. I want to quickly touch on pocket veto. This is a term for avoiding consideration, thus avoiding a vote. And I promise this term will come in a little bit later when we talk about what occurred in the 2020 legislative session. It's not an uncommon practice, and it usually involves using the suspense file. So the suspense file is a set of bills that typically have a fiscal impact. So go back to talking about the Appropriations Committee, who hear all of the fiscal related bills. They typically are the ones that issue or have the suspense file. In any bill with that fiscal component, they will add to that file, and they will keep there to have a discussion at a later time on those bills. So you might, if you've ever listened to an Appropriations Committee hearing, they'll read a long list of bills for suspense file, and those bills are typically taken up later, or that's also a way to pocket veto if it costs too much money, they just might leave it in suspense and it stays there and dies. Which leads me to our next term. So if you hear that a bill is dead or has died, that means it's failed committee, floor passage, by an assigned deadline. So it cannot come back from being dead. There are no zombie bills. And then the last two terms I want to just quickly go over, chaptered. So when a bill is signed by the governor, it gets assigned, when the bill is signed by the governor, it gets assigned a number by the Secretary of State, which means it's chaptered and it's now law. And then the last term I want to talk about is the effective date. So this is the date when the law takes effect. So typically that's January 1 of the following year. So any bills that were signed this year typically become effective January 1 of 2021, unless that bill has been marked an urgency bill. There were no bills, at least that I was watching, that were urgency bills this year. If it's an urgency bill, it becomes effective immediately the day that it's signed. And then also some bills may indicate a separate effective date. So if they want to implement a program in a couple of years, they will list that effective date there too. So I think that's important to note because not all bills will automatically be of January 1 the next year. Okay, so thank you for enduring me and listing those out. I promise you again that they are important and they will all make sense as we go along today. So I'm wondering at this point, are there terms you've heard that have you completely stumped? You're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So now would be the time to comment in the chat. Just if you've overheard anything that have just kind of left your head scratching. And if not, we'll continue on.
Megan, when you get a chance, we've got another question.
Okay, go ahead and read it to me, please.
What about the bills introduced by citizens? And does California law allow for special interest groups to propose changes?
I have never heard of bills being introduced by citizens. I know that citizens can work with their legislators to what they call sponsoring bills. A lot of the special interest groups are behind the scenes, and they're typically what we call the sponsors of legislation. But I have never heard of citizens with their own bills, but there are definitely people behind the legislators helping drive a lot of conversation.
Can citizens get bills in front of the Assembly or the Senate by way of either referendum or signatures, by gathering signatures and getting it on the ballot?
That would be a voting measure and not in the legislature.
Okay. Trying to keep up with the questions here. We've got some good ones rolling in since we're on a break. What is a trailer bill?
A trailer bill is kind of like a spot bill. It will basically come into play later down the road.
Gotcha. And the last one is, so we're up to date. How does a new bill get on the ballot for citizens to vote on? For example, the bail reform law.
You know what? I'm not sure exactly on how that works. I do know that there's a lot of signatures that have to be gathered for something to get on the ballot. I know sometimes legislators can pass resolutions or constitutional acts to get ideas on the ballot, but I'm not exactly sure what the requirements are for that.
And I think you can just Google about the proposition process. I think it's just a number of signatures that they need to get.
I know it's a lot of signatures.
It's a lot.
That I do know.
And we just had another one pop in since we've broken a little bit. Can you talk about committees? Can a bill die if it fails after one?
It can. I'm going to get into that just a little bit on the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to actually move on just in the effort of time, and I hope that I can continue to answer some of these questions as we go along. So here I want to talk about the cycle of a bill, and I know we watched the wonderful Schoolhouse Rock video, but I think that it's really important to kind of get into the weeds a little bit here. So the first step in legislation is obviously the bill is introduced. Again, as I talked about earlier, that can come from constituents reaching out to their legislators. Obviously, as I just mentioned, there's a lot of special interest groups that do work with legislators to get those ideas brought forward. So bills are typically introduced at the beginning of the year. They have until the end of February to introduce any bill. California is in a 2-year session, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But basically, they have 2 years to basically introduce bills. So bills introduced in the first year can also still be discussed in the second year. We just finished a 2-year session. And again, I'm getting way ahead of myself, but January 1, we start another 2-year session. So here your bill is introduced. From there, it goes to committee hearings. So for law enforcement or public safety, we mostly monitor the public safety committees. There's one in each house. And I should add, like when a bill starts, it starts in its own house. So a Senate bill would start in the Senate and an Assembly bill starts in the Assembly. So the first step would be heard in committee, in public safety committee, in their respective house. And then if they have that fiscal component, like I mentioned, they would then go to appropriations. If they don't have a fiscal component, they go straight to the floor. And the floor, where I talked about earlier, is where you have to have the 3 readings. And on the 3rd reading is when there is action taken, debate is had, and a vote is taken by the full House. So if we're in the Senate, it would be heard on the Senate floor and voted on by the Senate members. And if it goes through, then it goes to the other House. So Senate bills go to the Assembly bills go to the Senate, and the process starts all over again. They go to the Public Safety Committee in the opposite House, and they're read 3 times, and then there's floor action on the opposite House floor. From there, they return to the original House. So the Senate bills go back to the Senate, Assembly bills go back to the Assembly, and then they have what's called concurrent. And basically, throughout this entire process, from the time a bill is introduced to the time it returns to the original House, any amendments can be made. There's usually a deadline, a date where no more amendments can be taken, but that's pretty much almost all the way up until the end. So from there, it goes back to the original House for concurrent. So if you think about it, you know, that Senate bill had tons of changes made in the Assembly side. Well, now the Senate's going to be seeing those and concurring those. From there, once concurrent is had, it goes to the governor, and he can either sign or veto, and then the bill is implemented. So that's kind of our basic cycle of a bill. All right, so I think it's important to discuss who our key political players or leaders are in public safety in the Capitol. So our first key political leader is Nancy Skinner. She's a Democrat who represents the 9th District of California, which consists of cities within Alameda and Contra Costa counties, such as Berkeley, Oakland, Richmond, and San Leandro. She's the chair of the Public Safety Committee in the Senate and is most known for her prison reform and expansion of the Public Records Act. She's not a new kid on the block. She served in the Assembly from 2008 to 2014 and then was elected into the Senate in 2016. and she terms out in 2024. On the opposite side is Reggie Jones Sawyer. He's a Democrat who serves the 59th District of the Assembly, and he is the current Public Safety Committee Chair in the Assembly. He serves the Los Angeles area, primarily South Los Angeles. Some of his major legislation has been around cannabis and recidivism. He was elected into the Assembly in 2012, and he terms in 2024, and he has only served in the Assembly. These two individuals are the leadership in the Senate and the Assembly. So the Senate pro tempore, or the pro tem as we say, is Senator Toni Atkins. She represents the San Diego area, and the Assembly Speaker is Assemblymember Anthony Rendon, and he represents the Lakewood area of Los Angeles. Both are Democrats and term in 2024. Senator Atkins has previously served in the Assembly, and they both serve as leadership of their respective houses. I like to call them the parents of their houses. They solve a lot of infighting and work with a lot of key players in and outside of the Capitol on some of the larger measures. Both of them were big players in the use of force bills that we saw in 2019. And I'm sure that it will be no different as discussions on decertification continue next year. Also to note, last year there was legislation passed to allow both the Senate Pro Tem and the Speaker to appoint a person to the Post Commission. And finally, we have Governor Newsom, who, as you know, oversees it all. He's California's 40th governor and elected in 2018. And as I mentioned earlier, he has the authority to sign or veto any legislation presented to him. And I want to note that he also appoints the post commissioners. So up until last year, the governor was the only person who could appoint post commissioners. And now he appoints the majority of them with one from each, the Senate and the Assembly. Okay, so how is California different from the rest of the country? So California is only 1 in 10 states with a year-round legislature. Michigan, New York, and Pennsylvania are also the same, with their legislature working 80% of the year. Now, Alaska, Hawaii, Illinois, Massachusetts, Ohio, and Wisconsin are also considered year-round, but they're called like a year-round light, if you will. They are considered year-round based on their size, but their sessions are slightly shorter. Now, the rest of the country is only a half time to a 2/3 time legislature. The biggest difference with that, other than time, is compensation and staff size is significantly lower. And that's largely based on their population and district size. And as I've kind of been hinting around, California is what they call biennial, which means our sessions occur over a 2-year period. So when you hear that there's a 2-year session, that's where that comes from. So that just simply means that bills can be held the first year and revisited the second year. Assembly members in California are limited to 3 2-year terms, and senators are limited to 2 4-year terms. However, since the passage of Prop 28 in 2012, if they were elected after that proposition passed, they can serve up to 12 years in either house or a combination of both. So when I was talking about who our political leaders are on the public safety side, that's why I was talking about how they served in other houses and when their term limits are, because 12 years is a long time. So as I've been keep talking about this 2-year sessions, 2-year bill. So again, 2-year bills are typically introduced early in the first half of a 2-year session. But if they can't meet deadlines or they can't clear both houses, they can basically go dormant until the next year. And then they have a time period of when they can push those bills through in that second year period. And as I said earlier, we just completed a 2-year session. So 2021 will be the beginning of another 2-year session. Okay, so I want to just spend a couple of minutes and take any questions, but I don't want to spend too much time, John, if that's okay, just because I want to be able to take a break and respect everybody's time here.
No problem. Don has a couple for you.
Okay.
I'm not seeing any recent questions. John, you have something up there?
Yeah, let me go back and find them. One had to do with how is the California Constitution modified, Megan?
Those have to go through joint resolutions. And to be perfectly honest with you, I don't pay a lot of attention to them unless they're going to be modifying something to do with public safety.
Okay, there was also a comment and a somewhat of a question about the extensive research process that goes into these bills, either before they're drafted or while they're considering them. Could you comment on the research process?
Sure. Well, a lot of the research will come from, you know, either the sponsors of the bills or, you know, whoever is leading that conversation. But like I said, also, Ledge Council is the body that basically does the legal work behind it. So I guess that's not really research, but you know, they're the ones researching the penal code and the government code and the different laws that could be affected should those bills come into play. I don't know if that helps answer the question.
I think so. And then we had one about the names of the players that you put on the screen and what their names were. What would be a good way if someone wanted to find those names and who those people are?
You can go, so the Assembly and the Senate both have their own individual websites. I believe it's assembly.ca.gov, the same with the Senate. And you can go and see who leads any committee on either side of the House. I believe the Senate Pro Tem and the Speaker, their faces are right on the front of both of those websites. But yeah, they list all the committees. There are many. So you can find that information on those websites.
Okay, and we just had one more roll in, and then we'll move along. Are there any bills that we should expect to see proposed in January of 2021 that may affect law enforcement and officers?
Yes, and we will get to that, I promise.
Yeah, I figured we would. Thanks.
Okay. All right. So at this time, I want to just take a quick 5-minute break, get some water, use the restroom, and we will come back. Like it's let's say 1:51 right now. So let's come back at 1:56, please.
And do they get extra credit, Megan, if they know what movies that's from?
Yes, we're going to talk about that afterwards. Okay, so I hope I didn't lose everybody. So yes, so I was able to kind of briefly look in the chat. Yes, you were all correct. That is from the Breakfast Club. It was very humbling to have to explain to my young children what that was about, but they didn't understand why I was laughing. Before I continue on, I did want to go back. Someone had asked what a trailer bill was, and you stumped me live, even though I totally know what it is. A trailer bill is what's attached to the budget. They do typically start as spot bills, which is a placeholder. But when the budget comes out, at the beginning of the year, and then it goes through the process of basically like legislative confirmation, if you will. That is the trailer bills is where they put the language that backs the budget. So that's what a trailer bill is. Okay, so moving on. Before I begin talking about politics, which I know is why you're all here, I need you to know that Post maintains a neutral position in all legislation. So you're probably going, well, why? Well, prior to 2015, state agencies in California were allowed to engage in taking positions on legislation, and now we are not. Our role, excuse me, is to provide information and requested analysis to the administration and any other interested parties. And my question really is, well, who doesn't love Switzerland? So I think it's important to note that while Post is involved and at the table in a lot of conversations, we are not allowed to take a position of support or oppose. Okay, so 2019 was a historical year for Post and law enforcement in general, with the passage of AB 392 and SB 230 to change the California standard on use of force. And a little bit later in the presentation, when I kind of go into what happens after a bill is implemented, I'm going to discuss how those two pieces of legislation affected Post and what you can expect from Post in the coming months from those two pieces of legislation. But for now, I'm going to have you watch the video that Post produced right after the law went into effect. Some of you have probably seen it, so please just endure me. The production of this video is important to note that it actually started before the bill was signed because Post knew that it was going to be a big deal, that the urgency behind getting the facts out to your agencies was very important prior to the bill becoming effective in January 1. Okay.
On August 19, 2019, Assembly Bill 392 was signed into law. Aware of the impending revisions to law, California Post gathered a small group of staff and district attorneys to review the legal changes, answer questions, provide insight, and assess how the use of force standard may be shifting. The following short informational video steps through the new language in the law and provides analysis of how it might affect law enforcement and the way they will view use of force cases. Assembly Bill 392 effectively moves the use of force requirement from Penal Code 196 to Penal Code 835A. This program will walk through each new subsection of 835A in the Penal Code and highlight meaningful changes that become law on January 1st, 2020.
Our intent is to educate California law enforcement on the new use of force standard that is recently been signed into law and will be utilized throughout the state of California to make sure that officers are confident in what that law says and comfortable with it. We want them to apply the law, apply it safely for themselves so that they're safe. We want the communities to be safe, and we want to just alleviate as many concerns as possible as early as possible.
Prior to alleviating them, concerns first need to be identified, understood, and then addressed. At the conclusion of the meeting, each district attorney sat for a one-on-one interview to provide their professional advice on the new law. At times, they gave examples and follow those with their opinions as to the legality of using deadly force. If the facts were changed, even slightly, their legal analysis would be different.
I think that the legislature, with this law, is trying to codify an emphasis that's been happening in law enforcement towards de-escalation and the use of less lethal force.
To begin, the first four subdivisions of subsection A of 835A make several declarations regarding the gravity, perspective, evaluation of, and alternatives to use of force. The fifth and final subdivision of subsection A stands out for the first four in that it centers on individuals with disabilities and their encounters with peace officers. The law's focus on this raises the question, what has the law changed with regard to those who have disabilities?
It just points out something every law enforcement officer knows, which is people with disability are going to be in these situations and respond differently than someone without those disabilities. So they may not comprehend what's going on as carefully, and they may not be able to respond as they would want to.
Police officers know that they have to deal with the mentally ill, and it's fraught with peril. It is, because sometimes the mentally ill don't understand their situation, and they present a danger to police officers, a danger that could result in loss of life to the officer or someone else, that those officers have to deal with immediately.
The circumstances allowing for a peace officer's use of force contained in subsection B existed previously in 835A, with the exception of the insertion of one additional word. What does the addition of this word mean?
They added the word objectively to the term objectively reasonable. Prior to this, the law just said reasonable.
And that might seem like a small nuance, but essentially what it does is it creates an objective third-person standard.
But California law enforcement officers have long been using the objectively reasonable standard. That's the standard in Graham versus Connor, and that's the federal standard, and that's what they were all raised with.
It injects common sense into the decision-making process. So what would a objectively reasonable police officer do in that situation, given the same set of facts?
Subsection C focuses on the use of deadly force specifically and reads in part, a peace officer is justified in using deadly force only when the officer reasonably believes, based on the totality of the circumstances, that such force is necessary for either of the following reasons. A, to defend against an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or to another person. In this section, understanding the meaning of the term imminent is critical, and the legal definition can be found in subsection E.
When the person has the present ability, opportunity, and apparent intent to immediately cause death or serious bodily injury. So all of those things. And I'll say them again. When a person has the present ability, the opportunity, and apparent intent to immediately cause great bodily injury or death. So there are a couple of key words there. How does it appear, and must it be immediately confronted?
Section B addresses when deadly force may be used to apprehend fleeing felons. Officers may ask, what conditions are required in order for deadly force to be justifiable when apprehending a fleeing person for a felony?
It must be for a felony that threatened or resulted in death or serious bodily injury, and the officer must reasonably believe that the person will cause death or serious bodily injury to another unless immediately apprehended. Additionally, when feasible, a peace officer shall, prior to the use of force, make reasonable efforts to identify themselves as a peace officer and to warn the deadly force may be used unless the officer has objectively reasonable grounds to believe the person is aware of those facts.
I think in the vast majority of cases it's going to be apparent. You know, police officers wear uniforms, badge. So I think most of the time, unless you're talking about an officer that's undercover and really kind of a very specific situation, it's saying that the person should know that you're a police officer and that you're about to use deadly force if it's not obvious from the circumstances.
Subdivision 2 of subsection C is a note in that it specifically points out the circumstances when officers shall not use deadly force.
When the danger is just to the subject only, the officer believes the subject does not pose an imminent threat of death or serious bodily injury to the peace officer or another person. An example of when the only person that could experience death or serious bodily injury would be in a situation something like this. Somebody's in their own home, they're the only person in the home, and they have a knife and they're threatening to kill themselves. Law enforcement officers are outside surrounding all the exits and entrances into the house, and so the only person threatened is the person themselves. That would be an example of when deadly force wouldn't be appropriate.
In judging these situations, the term objectively reasonable officer found in this subdivision is key to understanding the type of standard officers face when making decisions regarding using force.
First of all, there's the average reasonable person, and the average reasonable person is deemed to have X number of experiences and knowledge. You up the standard when you say the average reasonable law enforcement officer because you assume that they've had training and experience as law enforcement officers. So when we're talking about a reasonable law enforcement officer, it is not that particular officer in that situation. That would be subjective versus objective.
Still a very practical, common sense standard that we're going to be using to look at these cases. And I should say that's the change I think that's been among the most important.
The introduction of this new law may create questions regarding whether there are now scenarios where officers must retreat. Subsection D of 835A addresses this with language that should dispel concerns of officers who may think they are now obligated to retreat in certain situations.
The bottom line that if an officer has to decide, oh, when do I have to retreat or not, I think it becomes an officer safety issue. And so why do we want to put that officer in harm's way when from the beginning they need to know you don't have to retreat?
They don't have a duty to retreat. They have to confront that danger. That doesn't change.
Key to becoming educated on all aspects of this law is the comprehension of specific terms that are used throughout. Subsection E contains definitions for several important terms. The deadly force definition is one that relies on an understanding of the concept of substantial risk.
Introducing the word substantial just sort of raises the level of risk that's required. Substantial is greater than regular risk, and that's the best I can do in defining it. When you're making these decisions, you've got to be confronted with the substantial likelihood or substantial threat that someone's going to be hurt.
The totality of the circumstances is a relatively simple but often overlooked concept. It is one that is both employed by officers in their contacts and by DAs in their reviews.
It's a great term, and it's a human term. And what it tells a district attorney and what it tells a law enforcement officer is taking everything into consideration, given everything in that situation that you are aware of at that time.
That means all the facts known to the officer, all the facts surrounding the situation, everything leading up to it, and every single fact that the officer was confronted with at that moment. We're going to take all that into consideration.
The second part of the definition of totality of the circumstances refers to the officer and subject conduct prior to the use of deadly force. This may raise questions regarding how long prior to the use of force is the conduct considered.
The way I interpret that, the conduct of the officer, is how the officer is conducting themselves during that event.
We're going to look at everything that the suspect did leading up to the use of deadly force. But we're also going to look at everything the officer did. One of the things that I do when I look at these cases is I want to know what dispatch said to the officer as the officer is approaching the scene, right? So to me, that takes into account what the officer knows, what the officer says, what the officer did leading up to this encounter that led to someone's death.
The only time I would add on to that would be if the suspect or the subject has had an encounter with this law enforcement officer in the past, and therefore that suspect may be considering that as well. In most cases, law enforcement officers will be meeting somebody for the first time under those circumstances. So an officer can't be held accountable to know what he doesn't know or couldn't know. But if he's had an encounter with that person in the past, then that should be considered as well.
Understanding the new law as it relates to the actions of peace officers in use of force situations is one thing. Having a perspective on how DAs look at cases in the context of these changes is another.
I'm going to use the necessary standard, and I'm going to ask, you know, was the use of force necessary in this situation, given everything the officer knew? I'm going to use the objectively reasonable standard. It's a common sense standard, but we're going to have to use that standard and look at the use of force and consider the legality of that particular action.
When the decision is made that if a shooting was justified or not, I can't do it based on what the public wants. I have to do based what the law is.
That what I want to say to police officers is be able and ready to articulate what you did and why. And that I think is going to help everybody sort of when we look at it in retrospect, it helps us understand what the real situation was at that moment.
One of the things that hasn't changed is that law enforcement officers still have a duty to protect the public. They want to do the right thing for the right reason. They're engaged on a constant basis with public safety and justice. It's why they put on the uniform.
California Post and the group of experts who worked on this are hopeful that this program has provided clear, straightforward answers to some of the questions that have arisen since this law was passed. Law enforcement officers are encouraged to contact their local district attorneys for their professional perspective. Additional resources are also available on the Post website.
Post is always there to make sure that they receive the proper training. They can always rely on their training. Post has a number of different resources, either on our website or through a simple phone call to Post to help them further their mission. And I would like to just thank them for everything that they do day in and day out.
Okay, thank you for spending those last 14 and a half minutes with me. Did you see any familiar faces in there? I hope you were paying really close attention to catch my cameo of gum chewing and looking super engaged. I joke, but being a part of that short video honestly was a career highlight. For those of you who don't always know the production side of Post, the work that goes on behind the scenes is amazing. We spent, I believe it was 2 days, just literally going over the legislation before the 3 district attorneys spoke in the video. And then being on the production side was really fun too. So I don't want to get too caught up in what's changed in use of force. I really truly believe the video explains what the standard has changed to. Obviously, there's a lot of conversation amongst many that. Someone have a question?
I just want to know where to find the training video, Megan.
Oh,
it's
yeah,
on the
I'll
Learning Portal.
I'll get there too.
Okay. Alrighty.
But obviously, there's a lot of questions people ask. Well, what's changed? And honestly, direct them to that video. I think it's really important to know that there is a change and that we have to inform our officers of what that change is, so that they can go out and do the best that they can and keep not only the public safe, but themselves safe as well. So outside of AB 392, Post was also mandated in Senate Bill 230 to create a use of force course to update the regular basic course in the academy with quite a few specific items, and then also to create guidelines of use of force. So I can tell you that Post has, excuse me, that Post has created that use of force course as required by SB 230. We have designed it to be a virtual reality course, and it's going to be used with new force option simulator machines that we are currently disseminating throughout the state. And we are also working on a train the trainer course but I believe the first offering just occurred about 1 or 2 weeks ago. The guidelines are in the final stages of development and editing. You should expect to see those within a month, I'm imagining. And really, we have been doing everything on our end to work as quickly as possible, because January 1 of 2021, every agency in California is expected to include the new standard as outlined in 8392 in your use of force policy. So just know that Post has your back on use of force. So I can't emphasize enough to really incorporate this new standard into all of your training. Post has absolutely gone above and beyond into making it as easy as possible for you to do this. The video I just showed you is on the learning portal, and it's actually on the public facing side of the website. So the benefit of taking it on the learning portal is that it will, there's no post credit, but it will mark the officer's profile in EDI that they have viewed that video. It's 15 minutes. It shouldn't take that long. I know agencies that have mandated or required all of their officers to take that training. We've also developed what we've called a bolt-on course. It's a 2-hour course. It's also on our website. I will give you that address in just a minute here. And this course was designed to be added on to your other courses. You can pick what course you want to add it on to. I think the most popular option has been to add it to a perishable skills course, because everybody has to do those. And then you add on the, it's literally a 2-hour piece on the use of force standard that has changed. Okay, I do need to say that I'm not an attorney, so I cannot give you legal advice on use of force, but I can, again, tell you that it is different and it needs to be shown to your officers. So here is that web page. You can go to the Post website and simply type in use of force in the search bar and it will come up. If you scroll to the bottom, it will give you the video link and the bolt-on course link, as well as some other information. Okay, so that was 2019. That was honestly the biggest piece of 2019. A lot happened in 2019, but I want to get into what happened in 2020. So I talk about it like it's past tense. I know we're still in 2020, but legislative session of 2020 is over. So if I talk in past tense, I'm not really going crazy. That's really, it's over. So this session, like the rest of the year, was supposed to be calm. 2019 was a heavy lift for law enforcement. We were kind of all hoping that it was just going to be smooth sailing. I'll just leave it at that. The first few months of 2020 were nothing of what we faced in 2019, and then March happened. And then May and June happened. And then fire season began. And now we're in election season. So how's everyone's blood pressure? Shall we continue? We all want to know how this horror film ends, right? This, by the way, this meme was another one I had to explain to my children because they don't understand that either. The same with, you know, Nintendo games that you have to blow on to get them to work again. They don't understand that either. It's quite amusing. Okay, so here are just a few of the major obstacles the legislature faced when March roared in. Obviously, as we all know, COVID rolled in and nobody knew what to do. It was close to spring recess. So legislators quickly finished business and left for their districts. It was during that time they began to draft rules to start meeting remotely, and they shut down the Capitol completely to outsiders. Lobbyists and other interest groups had to call in. That was a really fun process to watch as, you know, as the outside. So then they extended the spring recess, which then shortened necessary deadlines on one end and then made them longer on the other. I know having that up there, condensed timelines and extended timelines, seems like an oxymoron, but that's exactly what happened. Bills from the first year, remember that 2-year session I've been talking about? Well, they were then gutted and amended to reflect the current chaos. And we finished up with probably the most unprecedented floor session I've ever seen. I know unprecedented is the word of 2020. Okay, has anyone taken notes on all the legislative jargon that I've added in there? All right, so let's go back a little bit. Remember this diagram that we talked about 30 minutes ago? Well, I'm going to use it again to talk about how 2020 became chaotic and how a 2-year bill session came into play. So this is kind of like the climax of the dramatic story, if you will. So the red dot there, that is where most new bills were in mid-March 2020. The legislature then shut down the second half of March through April, and they returned in May and had to push legislation through their respective house by mid-June. So here, where it's normally kind of not a long process, but they have a couple of months here to get to here, they literally had a month to get from here to here. Okay, so then remember that 2-year session rule I discussed earlier? Well, that's where this comes into play. So 2-year bills that went inactive in the first year, in 2019, they ended here. So as you can see, they're already in the other house. So basically, Senate bills are in the Assembly and Assembly bills are in the Senate. I just need to remind everyone to please mute your microphones. Thank you. So these bills, these inactive bills, if you will, they're already in the opposite house. These bills then were gut and amended in early to mid-June to become an entirely different bill to address issues that were arising. So coronavirus, housing, homelessness, and obviously police reform became huge hot topics. But because they were already in the other house, they were able to jump many hurdles and accelerate quicker. I hope I haven't lost you guys yet. So fast forward to August, and this is where a lot of bills got into trouble. So August 31st is a hard deadline for bills to be passed. Legislators in both houses worked all the way to the midnight hour on the final day to try and pass. I stayed up with them. That was really fun. So basically, these bills were gut and amended. Let me get my little mouse over here. And then they were sent here. And this is where they had that hard deadline of August 31st. And here is where someone's not muted, and I'm sorry, it's really distracting. Okay. So now I'm totally off base, of course. Okay, anyways. So the August 31st deadline came, and this is where a lot of the action was going on. Bills that needed to be heard and sent back to their house hadn't done so yet. So both committees, the Senate and the, not committees, both houses, the Senate and the Assembly, worked all the way up until midnight on those deadlines to make sure that those bills were heard. And they were literally running across to the other house to get them back to where they needed to go for concurrent. And this is where some of those gut and amend bills got held up and never heard. So that's our pocket veto, if you will. Okay, so After that, Crazy Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, or as I referred to the end of session as an episode of Real Housewives, because I didn't mention that there was a lot of issues also with some senators contracted COVID in that process, and they were meeting remotely via Zoom at midnight, and there was a lot of arguing that happened. So after all of that, these were the bills that ended up on the governor's desk. I've highlighted the ones in red. They were vetoed, and the remainder were signed. I can tell you that in June, there were probably at least 16, if not more, bills that were addressing police reform in some fashion. So I consider law enforcement pretty lucky to have only had this go through. However, next year will be a different story. So I will talk briefly about each of these bills. So AB 846 by Assemblymember Burke, this bill addresses hiring standards for peace officers. It requires that the psychological evaluation of a peace officer include bias against race or ethnicity, gender, nationality, religion, disability, or sexual orientation. This bill does require POST to study, review, and update our regulations and screening materials to identify explicit and implicit bias against those biases that I listed out there earlier. So that's going to be a significant amount of work for POST, and obviously that's something that's going to have to be separated out as far as the screening process for officers going forward. So expect to see more from us on that matter. POST does have until January 1st of 2022 to make those changes to our materials. And if you don't mind, we'll save questions about all of these to the end, because I know that there will be some. So Assembly Bill 1196 by Assemblymember Gibson. This one should be no stranger to anyone. This was the bill on the carotid restraint. This bill prohibits the authorization of the use of carotid restraint. I say that like that because the media and a few legislators have outright said that it's a ban on the carotid restraint. It is not a ban. It is the prohibition of the authorization to use the carotid restraint. Now, POST was in a little bit of a different situation. The governor did ask that we remove it from our training. It's not that simple. It is a regulation that the training happens at the academy level. So we had to take it to the POST Commission, which we did back in, I think, June. The commission did vote to remove it from the basic training. And we have since gone through the regulatory process to have that removed, and I believe it has been officially removed from training. POST did take it to another level based on that request from the administration to remove it from other certified training. So if you had training within your departments that had training on the carotid restraint, you were asked to remove that. Okay, so I'm skipping over the ones that were vetoed to talk about afterwards. AB 1506 by Assemblymember McCarty. This bill requires the Department of Justice to, and the AG, or as they have listed, the state prosecutor, to investigate incidents of officer-involved shootings that result in the death of an unarmed civilian. So DOJ is going to be super busy getting their new bureau or division started in the next 2 years. This starts on July 1st of 2023. that this new division will review those types of officer-involved shootings. And then the last one that was signed was SB 480. And this one seems simple enough. It would prohibit law enforcement from wearing or having a uniform that is made from a camouflage print or pattern material. This came out of some confusion, or I should say, or a uniform that looks something like it would be from the United States Armed Forces. This came out of some of the civil unrest that occurred over the summer. I think there was some confusion between some law enforcement uniforms and the National Guard. So this law prohibits law enforcement uniforms from being similar to those. However, there is an exception for SWAT. SWAT is still allowed to wear what SWAT wears. So going back to what was vetoed, because I think it's important to highlight the discussions that have been had and also talk about why they were vetoed and what we can expect next year. So AB 1299 was a bill that would have required Post to update our Notice of Appointment or Termination form, or NOAT, to include if an officer was discharged, not discharged, but if they retired or resigned in lieu of an investigation. If they had retired or resigned in lieu of an investigation for a serious, of a serious nature, we didn't say serious misconduct, we said serious nature, then it would require that NOAT to be marked, and it would require those agencies to complete those IAs behind those resignations or retirements. And then it would also have required the agency to make that note on that officer's profile. So this bill was intended to help close some gaps that are there with officers who are going from agency to agency, with maybe some a little bit of a cloud following them, if you will. So this bill was vetoed. If you go to the governor's website, you can see why he vetoed. He liked the concept, but he didn't feel it went far enough. So that is pretty much why it was vetoed. And I bring it up because I'm sure this concept will come up again next year. SB 629, this bill was a really dangerous bill. It would have allowed reporters, people of the press, to essentially join your officers in the command post area during a protest or any sort of civil unrest. And the way that they had defined reporters was pretty much anyone with a business card and a camera, which, as we know today, could just be your cell phone. So the governor did acknowledge when he vetoed this bill specifically that he felt it was a danger to everyone, to officers and members of the public. So those were the biggest bills that were passed in 2020. And I purposely have not addressed SB 731, so I will get to that. Let's see. Okay. So SB 731. SB 731 was the police decertification bill that did not make it out of the floor at all this year. So that was kind of part of the crazy Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, or episodes of Housewives, whatever you prefer, that occurred at the end of session, and this bill did not get heard. SB 731 was basically the decertification bill. It would have made Post the oversight agency of decertification. It would have created a separate board from the commission to look at cases of decertification. It listed several items of what serious misconduct would have been grounds for decertification. This bill also had a component of qualified immunity. This bill had a lot. I'm trying to think off the top of my head all of the things that were in it. I can tell you that this topic of decertification is not going to go away. There are already conversations happening in the Capitol as to what we're going to see in 2021. And I'll get to that in just a little bit. I do want to add that California is currently only one in I think 4 or 5 states that does not decertify their peace officers. And I believe the states that don't are also looking at adding that to decertify. Okay, so here's where we're gonna have a little fun and we're gonna test my Zoom skills. I'm going to send you all into breakout rooms. We have almost 200 people, looks like here. So I'll do my best to not make the groups too large. Don't leave, you're not allowed to leave. This is like, you know, when you're live and everyone's at a table and everyone's like, oh God, we have to talk to each other. So I do want you to engage with each other. I'm gonna ask you to talk about some issues that your agency is facing, concerns that your community has. And I'm asking this because I think it's important to know going into next year, what are you all facing? What is some legislation or some topics that legislators should be considering? And I think that you don't have to be on patrol to know what your officers are talking about. So I promise this won't take very long. I'm only gonna put you in here for maybe 5 minutes. And then we'll take a poll at the end. No one will have to get on and do talking. So we'll do that. Okay, testing my Zoom skills. Okay, so it looks like we're all coming back. Hopefully I didn't lose too many people. Now I kind of know how my children's teachers feel. That was very interesting. Okay, so let's regroup. I hope that wasn't too terrible. But I'm curious to know what some of the topics you came up with and how your communities are being affected. So I'm gonna do a poll just for the sake of time. And just click as many choices as you can. You know, what were some of the things that your group might have talked about? Or if your group didn't talk, then maybe what is really affecting your communities and your agency. And you're welcome to use chat as well. I just know it's a little bit harder to follow sometimes. I'm reading through some of your comments. Sorry, clearly I didn't give you enough time. You want to come back? I'm doing this again tomorrow. And you guys are being welcome to try to get in the chat rooms again tomorrow. Maybe we'll have a little bit more time tomorrow. I definitely want to have some more time to answer questions. Okay, so it looks like most of you have responded here. I'll just share the results. Okay, it's not letting me end that. Okay, hopefully that took that off of your screen. Okay, so I'm just gonna move on because we only have maybe about 20 minutes left and I definitely wanna be able to answer questions here at the end. Okay, so this too, just a reminder for everyone. Yeah, I'm pretty glad that there's toilet paper back in the grocery store. Okay, so we obviously have talked about what happened in 2019, what happened in 2020, and then I really want to kind of do the reading the political tea leaves of what to expect in the future. So first, it's really important to note that the state is obviously in a fiscal crisis. And because of that, there will be budget shortcomings for the next several years. So what this means for legislators, they will have to pass legislation that either requires no funding or very little funding, because the funding that will be designated will be to some of the major issues. Obviously, I think there will be some funding for police reform because it is going to be one of those major issues, but we have yet to see how much will be involved. So I know I've vaguely touched on decertification and the rise and fall of SB 731 in 2020. It will come back. The rumor has it that the law enforcement associations are already working with some of the leaders in the Senate to develop a counter bill to 731. This is pretty similar to what happened with use of force with SB 230 and AB 392. Those bills started as opposites to each other, and as they progressed and made amendments and the different groups worked together, they became sister bills, if you will. I can tell you that Post is at the table in these conversations. We were at the table with all of the different groups and stakeholders with 731, and we'll continue to do what we do as we move into 2021. Post has also been working with other states who do decertify their peace officers, just to kind of do their research on our end, like what works for other states, what could work in California. Obviously, with the number of peace officers here in California, it does create a lot of issues, and what works in Oregon or Arizona may not necessarily work in California. There is also going to be a lot of continued police reform measures. Yesterday, the governor's office released recommendations by his policing advisors. These recommendations were largely focused on improving law enforcement response to protests and demonstrations. In the release were several recommendations to Post to make adjustments to our training courses and guidelines. Also, the Assembly has formed the Select Committee on Police Reform, which ironically, they had their first meeting this morning. That committee is chaired by Assemblymember Mike Gibson, who was the author of the Carotid Restraint Prohibition of Authorization Bill. And he's a former peace officer. The committee meeting was very interesting, and I'm interested to see what that select committee does moving forward. And also, we're in an environment with coronavirus. Just because 2020 ends doesn't mean that the virus goes away. So how will Capitol activity look in January? Will we be meeting back in person? Will the communication shortcomings we had in 2020 continue to plague the legislature in 2021? So those are all things that I'm kind of watching, if you will. Okay, so I really gonna quickly go through this. I wish we had a little bit more time, but I wanted to quickly touch on what happens after a bill is signed. Sometimes people are like, well, it got signed back in August. What's taking you guys so long? Well, obviously there are implementation deadlines. Sometimes a lot of work has to go into it, which might be why it takes a year to be implemented. If it's a regulation, the Post Commission has to meet on that regulation change, and they have to okay it. And then after that, the regulation has to go through the Office of Administrative Law. This is an independent executive branch agency that's charged with reviewing state agency rulemaking and regulations. So we are kind of at the mercy of OAL, if you will, once a regulation change is proposed. We've had several legislative mandates that have been sent to OAL for regulation change that have been sent back to us. And sometimes it can take up to a year, if not longer, to get those regulations set right, and then obviously pushed out to all of you. Okay, so now that you have all this wealth of information, what can you do? Work with your law enforcement associations, Cal Chiefs, the State Sheriff's Association, the Peace Officers Association, PORAC. They are all huge, huge forces in the Capitol. I encourage you to get involved with their committees and be a part of those conversations. Each one of them has a legislative committee. Contact your legislators. You are their constituents. Write them, call them, email them, talk to the staff in the district offices. Engage your leadership. Yes, talk to your command staff. Sit down with your chief, your sheriff, be a voice for your colleagues in your community. You can do that. And then lastly, engage with your community. How do you meet the needs of the public you serve? And, you know, I encourage you to attend community meetings safely, of course, wear your mask, go to city council meetings. I know, who really wants to do that? But be willing to listen to the concerns of your community members, because they are also constituents and they are also going to be doing the same thing that you are in reaching out to their legislators. So if you're not sure who your legislators are, this is a great website to find that out. And if I have done my job today, you can also track your own legislation. Anyone can look up legislation. This is a website that I visit often. You can set up a free account. Anyone can do that. You can enter in keywords, and you can watch your inbox fill with tons of alerts as the year goes on. You can track any legislation from start to finish. Or if you don't want to do that, you can contact me. I'm here to talk legislation, past or present. You can tell me your agency's needs, hopes, dreams, etc. Just no complaints. Remember, I don't take complaints. And you know, people ask me all the time how I'm able to do my job. They always say, isn't it so stressful? Well, I've come to the conclusion that my knowledge of baking and love of desserts has allowed me to cope, because stressed is dessert spelled backwards. So I can't even make that up. That's the truth. Okay, so this is gonna be our final Q&A. We have, I'll say 10 minutes. I do wanna say before we start, thank you so much for staying with me. And I hope that you took away at least one thing from this session. So let's have at it, and I'll see what else, how much I can cover in our 10 minutes.
All right. Well, the first one that a lot of people had questions on is this subject of decertification. Basically, why do we need it? What did the bill look like?
Do we want to start there?
Yeah, if you'd like, I can address that, because I've been very involved with that, if you'd like.
I would like to.
So,
hear your perspective.
yeah, hi everybody. So California actually is an outlier in the decertification world. Most states have a decertification process. They license their officers or certify them. And then if they commit certain types of crimes or major misconduct, there's a way to unlicense them so they can't bounce around from agency to agency. At least that's the why behind it. And California currently doesn't have that. Each individual agency is responsible for doing a background and hiring their officers, regardless of who they are. There's no licensing that comes from the state, like a medical license, if you will, or a nursing license. So the state legislature wants to get on board with kind of how the rest of the country is. Again, I think we're only one of 5 states that don't have this process. Having sat on a commission in another state for a short while, we were involved in that process. And the way that it would work is when you do your NOAT for an officer separating from employment, whether it be through resignation or termination, or retirement. On that NOAT, there were boxes that the agency is supposed to check if they apply to that officer leaving. And it basically, in that state, is the officer leaving because of major misconduct? Are they leaving because of lying and dishonesty? Are they leaving because of a misdemeanor conviction? Are they leaving because of a felony conviction? And if any of those boxes were checked, it kicked off a post investigation to look into the circumstances of that officer's leaving that agency. And if it met the codification of the law, then there would be an arbitration process, just like a board of rights or an arbitration or a hearing for that license. And there would be notice and an opportunity to be heard, and it would be just like a little mini arbitration trial. And then there'd be a neutral third party that decides whether that peace officer keeps his certification or not. The agency didn't have a say in it. Post didn't have a say in it. It's a neutral third party process, but it's kicked off by the manner in which the officer leaves. So I know that was some of the conversation going around the legislature this last session. Just like Megan alluded to, it's not a dead issue. I think we can see it again next year. I don't know how it'll play out in California, but that's how they do it in other states. So hopefully that answered your question. And I know time is short, so I'm going to jump right back into another one here for you, Megan. Has to do with AB 1945. AB 1945. People are curious about its impact on post. That's the one that's the reclassification of public safety dispatchers as first responders. Do we know where that's at and what it means for post and the profession?
Yeah, that bill was signed into law. As far as I know, it doesn't change any of the post requirements for dispatchers. It simply just acknowledges that they are first responders.
Okay, thank you. Next question, any update on losing qualified immunity in the state?
No, in fact, that was a part of the conversation with the Assembly Select Committee on Police Reform this morning. It wasn't the majority of the conversation, but there was some conversation as to why that's important. So stay tuned. I assume that will be another point of conversation again as we move forward this next session.
Next question, since certain training is newly mandated, is there any mandate that the state has to provide funding for it?
That is definitely a slippery slope. If training is indeed mandated, for example, racial profiling training is mandated to be taken every 5 years, that is a funded training because it is mandated. Don't quote me, definitely check with your regional consultant on how that works on the post end. But if it's mandated, it should be funded.
And the last question has to do with the Peace Officer Bill of Rights. Some other states don't even have a Peace Officer Bill of Rights, which is true. Is POBAR going to be updated in California?
That I don't know specifically. I know that when we were talking about decertification this year, POBAR definitely played a role in that. And again, was also discussed during the select committee meeting this morning.
All right, and I'm just checking for any last minute questions rolling in. A lot of thank yous for a job well done, Megan. You did do.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. A lot of kudos from everybody, and thank you everybody for joining us. I don't see any other questions, Megan.
All right, well, I do have my contact info up on the screen. Again, please give me a call instead of sending an email if you feel it's sensitive information. And I'll be doing this again tomorrow. So if you want to join me again tomorrow, you might get some different tidbits that I didn't mention today. So I also want to do my due diligence and say to complete the survey, go to that link there, make sure you get CPT credit for putting up with my terrible jokes for the last 2 hours. And I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Not to take anything away from you, but Carl thinks the Schoolhouse Rock video was the best.
That's good. That's good.